Marshall McLuhan was a genius. He foresaw the future of communication decades before the technology to make that communication possible even existed. And he predicted the myriad changes this technology would have on the way we communicate, live, and think. Douglas Coupland is not just a wonderful novelist and artist. He is, in and of himself, the contemporary expression of McLuhanism, and therefore the perfect biographer of the man who broke the shackles of linear communication. In this portrait, he gets us into the mind of Marshall McLuhan, where we see him seeing us.
Back in 1988, fax machines had just come out, and they write cool and sexy. I worked at a magazine, and they said, do something interesting about fax machines. So I went and did a rubbing of his gravestone, and then we faxed it around the world because it had the taglines that fax machines used to have on them. It was sort of a visual, poetic way of expressing the way that the world was shrinking at that point in time. And I think that fax with Marshall, that was sort of a harbinger of things to come.
In 1962, in the golden age of television, Marshall McLuhan, in a single paragraph, predicted the rise of the personal computer, the internet, and Google.
The next medium, whatever it is, will include television as its content, not as its environment. A computer as a research and communication instrument could retrieve the individual's encyclopedic function and flip it into a private line to speedily tailored data of a saleable kind.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that just like holy? I mean, that's probably the most prescient thing he ever wrote. Forget the media is the message, forget Global Village. He just nailed it.
Instead of going out and buying a package book, you will go to the telephone, describe your interests, your needs, your problems, and they at once Xerox, with the help of computers from the libraries of the world, all the latest material just for you personally. This is where we're heading under electronic information conditions. Products increasingly are becoming services.
If he got the internet and bang on, then who's to say his thinking ends there? Maybe it goes on for another 100 years. We're always curious to know what's coming down the road.
Born in the small prairie city of Edmonton in July 1911 to parents Herbert and Elsie, Marshall is 4 when the Mcluhan family moves to Winnipeg.
The Mcluhans are an incredibly intelligent family, very gifted intellectually, all of them. I think with Elsie, his mother, who was living in the Canadian prairies in the early 20th century, I mean, God, how catastrophically boring that must have been for her, someone that bright. And she always wanted to escape.
When Marshall is 11, Elsie begins traveling across the country to teach elocution. She has a highly developed ear for sound, a trait that Marshall inherits.
He had an astonishing sonic sensitivity. He had a terrific memory as well. His ability to just inhale books one after another and have them stick.
Elsie delights in Marshall's gifts, and they develop a private world in which they challenge each other in language and debate. Elsie believes Marshall is destined for greatness and pushes him to excel. At 19, he writes in his diary,
I must obtain worldly success to a real degree.
Marshall enters the University of Manitoba. His intellectual brilliance is matched only by his utter lack of social skills.
He had a lot of tics and idiosyncrasies. His love of repetition, his extreme love of ritual. You could never actually have a conversation with him. He just sort of broadcasted at you when you're with him in a room. And he was eccentric in any situation.
Marshall goes on to Cambridge to study English literature on scholarship. The rarefied atmosphere there is a dream for Marshall, and he experiences a happy period of intellectual growth. While there, he is introduced to the New Criticism.
New Criticism was a line of literary critique that all there is the book itself and the words within it. They don't want to know the history of the writer, nothing. It's the opposite of contextualization.
The New Criticism feeds his instinct to challenge old modes of thinking. Marshall becomes entranced with obscure words. He likes to pun and can play with a single word for hours, toying with its richness of sound and nuance.
He was obsessed with a lot of things. One of things was James Joyce. He liked the way that sort of language sort of plays around inside your head. That was a fundamental building block for him.
After completing his degree at Cambridge in 1936, Marshall lands a position as teacher's assistant at the University of Wisconsin. He soon discovers he has nothing in common with his students.
Marshall looked at American teenagers as Martians. They had no sense of self-awareness, of historicity. In lieu of being able to connect with these people emotionally or intellectually, he maybe decided to see them as scientific experiments.
I began to study their popular culture as a way of setting up a more natural dialogue with my students. That is, I began to study the sports, the humor, the comics. I hit upon the discovery that if you can't even grasp the nature of your own world, why spend your time studying somebody else's world?
Yearning for a deeper meaning in his own life, Mcluhan joins the Catholic Church. He will remain a devout Catholic all his life.
He cared about the world, but he also despaired for the world as well. He saw it going to hell in a handbasket. If he thought it was fixable, he certainly never said. So he didn't care about the future. He cared about his own afterlife.
Marshall is hired as a full professor at the Catholic St. Louis University. His wide-ranging intellectual interests and masterful speaking skills make him a phenomenal lecturer, able to juggle several balls of thought at once.
Pontificating came so naturally and so utterly without effort. He was fantastically intelligent.
In 1938, Marshall's mother introduces him to a young actress named Corinne Keller-Lewis. She's warm, engaging, and universally liked. Marshall falls in love.
But I think he wanted to find someone who was maybe an antidote to his own pathologies, and I think he was very lucky in finding Corinne. That she understood him and didn't try and change him and tried to protect him from himself.
They marry in 1939 and move to England for Marshall to complete his doctorate at Cambridge. His dissertation is on Thomas Nash, an obscure 16th century pamphleteer.
The internet of Thomas Nash's time were pamphlets that went around from people to people. And like, oh, did you see the latest pamphlet? He was producing information in a certain way that was more urgent than waiting to get published in a leather-bound volume, say. So maybe it's not so obscure at all.
Mcluhan is becoming interested in the way that different types of communication have affected past civilizations, a herald of his momentous theories to come. Marshall Mcluhan obtains his doctorate from Cambridge in 1943, and he and Corinne return to St. Louis. With the birth of their first son, Marshall becomes fascinated with the trappings of modern domesticity.
He was obsessed with Blondie, that cartoon, where Dagwood is the bumbling husband, and Marshall Mcluhan saw Dagwood as trying to subvert American manliness.
He writes about that cartoon in a brilliant attack on pop culture. No one before him has ever taken pop culture seriously enough to subject it to critical analysis. Mcluhan is a pioneer.
He realized that when he talks about pop culture and mass culture, suddenly everyone listens. Back then, there were very few voices saying, what on earth is with this weird new generation?
Marshall befriends influential artist Wyndham Lewis, whose ideas spark Mcluhan to further explore the effects of media on our senses.
Wyndham Lewis is certainly one of the artists who thought that the form of the letter on the page affected the way we intake the content of those letters. So he had this magazine called Blast, where the words would go like boom, like that. And it was extremely ahead of its time. And I think to someone as sensitive to language as Marshall Mcluhan, it was like catnip, really.
After the war, Marshall moves his growing family to Toronto, where he is offered a position as an English professor at St. Michael's, the Catholic college at the University of Toronto. At the time, Toronto is an intellectual hotbed of ideas about communication. It's home to thinkers and writers like Harold Innis, Northrop Frye, and later Glenn Gould. Innis was studying how the exploitation of beaver pelts had affected the physical shape of the country.
They all were looking at how does any network work? How did the postal system work in England? How did the telephone system change things? And with Marshall, it was like, oh, well, how is the electronic cybernetic connection changing everything, and where's that going? So you had Marshall being able to go from rivers where beaver pelts were being trapped and made to the 21st century, all in this amazing arc. It's kind of dazzling, actually.
In 1951, Mcluhan publishes The Mechanical Bride, a compilation of essays taking aim at advertising in the consumerist age.
With The Mechanical Bride, you had the very first warnings that the stuff that you're seeing, it's not just a cartoon, it's not just an ad, it's actually something else, and that's probably the more important thing, which is, of course, the medium, the magazine, the TV show, the whatever form you're taking it in, that is actually changing you far more than an ad for something, that our insides were merging with our electronic outsides.
It's the early 1950s, and television is changing the world. But there are no words to describe or analyze this revolution.
It was no longer just a toy for rich people. It was this thing that everybody had, and it democratized information in such a powerful way. And, it was a very new thing. People had no idea what it was. Suddenly there's this guy who's like, he thinks he might have an answer.
Television is a serious medium. It's an inner-oriented medium. You are the vanishing point. It goes inside you. You go on an inner trip. It is the prelude, the vestibule to LSD. If you're surrounded with banality of programming, then why not devote your powers to discerning patterns and exciting matters in the banalities?
His theories have the academic world tuning in, and Mcluhan's lectures are an instant hit. Marshall is a master at engaging an audience, and everyone is wondering what this English lit professor will say next.
His ideas were so new, and they were so extreme, and they were expressed in such a strange manner that nobody could really quite understand what it was he was saying, but they did know he was saying something quite important.
Anything I say is addressed, in a sense, to the outside world as the enemy, if you like. And if comments about it appear obscure, it is as nothing compared to the obscurity of the scene or the situation one is trying to elucidate.
Just as the attention to his ideas is building, tragedy strikes. His mother, Elsie, has a stroke. Marshall visits her often and reads her detective novels. She dies in 1961.
I think everyone in life, at some level, is trying to please their parents. When Elsie died, he felt 1,000 pounds lighter, and he actually could do things without worrying about her opinion. And I think that was like a big, a wake-up call. His mother's passing was what finally ignited his career.
In the early 60s, Mcluhan's lectures at the University of Toronto are the place to be. People are in awe of his ability to come up with new ideas in front of an audience and are lining up to see it firsthand.
And sometimes students would lob him questions, and he would come up with something on the spot that would be kind of brilliant, actually. He was like an information leaf blower that he would just shoot the stuff out, and you sort of sat there and got the blowback from it.
The ideas that come out of these lectures become the material for his 1962 book, The Gutenberg Galaxy.
What sticks in my mind from Gutenberg Galaxy is the sense of premonition that saturates almost every page of the book.
In it, Marshall studies the impact of the printing press on human culture, arguing that it drove mankind from an acoustic tribal culture to an individualistic mechanical one. He then goes on to predict that with the rise of electronic media, mankind will once again return to its oral tribal roots, launching his famous phrase, the global village.
The global village is the fact that we all live together inside this thing called the cloud, and that our biological selves and our virtual selves are sort of getting all mushy, figuring out where I end and my media existence begins all together. How many friends do you have? How many likes do you get? Did I read your blog? Did you read mine? We're all just hyper aware of each other's existence.
Mcluhan is reaching a global level of fame for his ideas. In 1963, he founds the Center for Culture and Technology at the University of Toronto.
It was a place to put down roots, the bricks and mortar boutique outpost for the Mcluhan philosophy itself.
Mcluhan releases a textbook entitled Understanding Media, in which he proposes that technology is an extension of our central nervous system, connecting us in new ways. In it, he also writes his famous phrase, "The medium is the message."
When you say the medium is the message, what you're really saying is that whether it's a book or a slate or a tablet, what you're actually reading or taking out of it isn't so much the content, it's that the medium starts rewiring your brain. In a very literal, organic sense, you become what you behold. And especially right now, we're probably in the greatest medium is the message moment in human history.
The book is a hit. It sells over 100,000 copies. New York newspapers call him the greatest thinker since Newton, Darwin, and Freud. He's called hip, groovy, a fraud, a monster, a genius. Young people love him.
Marshal McLuhan, you say TV has turned the world into a global village. Am I right? Will it turn us all into global village idiots?
An idiot means a very private person. That's a Greek word meaning a very private person. I'm losing my idiot status steadily. I'm becoming less and less private. I'd much rather be an idiot.
Marshall McLuhan was not a fan of technology, and quite the opposite. He hated it. He thought it made the world a polluted, horrible place.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. Many people seem to think that if you talk about something recent, you're in favor of it. The exact opposite is true in my case. Anything I talk about is almost certainly to be something I'm resolutely against.
He didn't believe in the future. He believed in the afterlife, which is a very different thing. And because he didn't care about the future, there's this incredible detachment that comes from his analysis of the present and where it may be going.
By the late 1960s, Marshall is at the pinnacle of his career. In 1967, he publishes the blockbuster The Medium is the Massage, a pun on his now famous aphorism.
The Medium is the Massage was the ultra super pop paperback book that you really had to have if you were even remotely young back in the 1960s. And it was just Mcluhanisms that had been taken by some designers and whipped into this very sexy clip art filled black and white book. It's a wonderful book. I think it sold over 1 million copies, and it spread the seed.
But even as Mcluhan's fame and influence reach new heights, he is about to face the challenge of a lifetime. For years, Mcluhan's brilliant lectures have been haunted by petit mal seizures, freezing him in the middle of a sentence. Now his blackouts become more frequent, and his family insists he seek medical help. He undergoes brain surgery, and the doctors remove a benign tumor the size of a lemon.
And that affected his thinking. How could it not affect your thinking? And he was left actually unable to read.
Mcluhan is in pain and is more sensitive to light and sound. He is still as talkative and idiosyncratic as always, but there is no longer the crackling of new ideas.
I think all of Mcluhan's ideas had just sort of run their course. And if you were a student in 1972 or 3, say, are you going to take Marshall McLuhan's class? Oh, I don't know. It's kind of passé now.
Mcluhan's theories become more cynical. He worries about an almost biblical apocalypse where we have no morality in an era where state surveillance is total.
In a broad sense, Mcluhan saw disaster. I think he saw the loss of privacy, the loss of maybe a certain sort of dignity, and maybe a tendency for the world to lose its sense of the profound. I think that worried him very much.
At the speed of electricity, you can't have goals. You're already there. And we are increasingly discarnate, de-physicalized. And so this is another kind of nightmare which obsesses us with sex and all the needs of the body, just about the time our bodies are disappearing.
He becomes consumed with new theories, in particular the idea of discarnate man.
Mcluhan had this notion of man taken outside the body and being converted into symbols and noises and sounds that could be shipped anywhere in the electronic universe and then reinterpreted or stored, which is exactly what we do with our lives now.
In 1979, a catastrophic stroke leaves Mcluhan speechless, unable to read or write. Marshall had imagined a return to a purely tribal acoustic world. And now he has it. It is the worst sort of answered prayer.
And so I suppose he would look at all the books he had done, and it would be infinitely frustrating to not be able to access them. On the other hand, if you talked to him, you could understand everything perfectly. It was the silence from inside his head that would have been so frustrating.
Following a pleasant evening with his friends and family, Marshall McLuhan dies at home on New Year's Eve, 1980.
People would say, Marshall, what do we do? How do we protect ourselves from the future? And he brought out the old poem, The Maelstrom, and his metaphor there was the only sort of solace you can find is by trying to find patterns within the maelstrom. And you may not find any, but it's the act of looking that's going to keep you safe and alive. Part of the modern condition is the sensation that we're always having these new technologies dumped on us month after month. It's accelerating. You can feel overwhelmed by it. It's sort of comforting to be able to look back at this guy who was able to see all of this coming, and he knew why it was coming. And maybe if you read him, you'll find a pattern and a logic to what's happening in the world, and maybe you can find strength in that and then build it forward.